I had also the joy to meet him later at another one and invite him. So, sometimes one just go for the safe bet, and Kevin is a pretty safe bet. So if one wants to have a speaker who is entertaining and deep and interesting and everything at the same time, Kevin is an ideal choice. So I just did that. And he is, of course, also a very good friend and a lovely person. So I'm most excited about what he's going to tell us about himself, and also what he's going to tell about al-Maʿarrī and Shīrāzī and veganism. And I think he's going to reform the reformed format what we have in the first part. So I'm also curious about what he comes up with. So okay, Kevin, you lead the show.
Thank you so much, István. Thank you to everyone who was involved in setting up the Monday Majlis, to the technologists and other people, and to all of you who are attending. István, that was really sweet. I really appreciate what you said, and I feel exactly the same way. A kinship right from the start. So thank you for that, and also for inviting me today. I know the Monday Majlis starts with a bit of sort of personal, discussion, introduction. So maybe what I'll do is I'll speak about myself for just a few minutes, 5 minutes, and then I can open the floor to questions or just conversation or whatever appropriate to a Majlis. And then after 15 or 20 minutes, I can launch into some discussion of my research, and then we can have a question and answer. So just to introduce myself a little bit, my name is up here, but I'm Kevin. You can call me Kevin. And I was born and raised in the United States, not speaking any foreign languages. You all probably know the joke about what do you call a person who speaks 3 languages? You call them a trilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks just 1 language? American. So that was very much my upbringing. I didn't, learn foreign languages growing up, but I always felt myself in love with language. I was a writer from a very young age. I really enjoyed that. And I also was a performer. At one point in my life, I wanted to be an actor. A colleague once said recently that, teachers tend to be failed actors. A lot of us have sort of that in our past, and, we're once, in theater and other things like that. That certainly describes me as well. So anyway, I first, became fluent in a foreign language when I lived in Brazil for 2 years. So I speak Portuguese and learned Portuguese there. And that was formative for me because it sort of opened in my mind a place where learning foreign languages always felt like math, which was kind of my arch nemesis growing up. I was never comfortable with it. And grammar and when you learn a foreign language in a classroom as opposed to going out and speaking with people, it just feels like, it felt to me very confining that there was only one right or wrong way to say things. And I hadn't attained the level of fluency where you can sort of play with style and rhetoric and other things the way that you can. So anyway, living in a foreign country, speaking a foreign language for the first time, that sort of opened this this door in my mind and led me to study languages at university. And I wanted to study something non-Western European, something a little bit different from sort of the usual thing that's taught, at least in the United States. It happened that my university, which is the university I now teach at, I studied there as an undergraduate, had and still has a very strong Arabic program and Middle East studies program. And, by chance, I sort of fell into that. And, at every stage of learning Arabic have been challenged by its richness and complexity and its beauty. I'm sure all of you have had similar experiences with Arabic or other languages that you've studied. And, that was increased doubly when I learned that Arabic has a rich tradition of classical literature and especially poetry. That's always been a love of mine. And so discovering that and wanting to, have some sense of proficiency in that sort of kept me going in this. Anyway, that all took me up to, my early to mid 20s, did my PhD work at University of Chicago, lived for a year in Cairo on the CASA program, Center for Arabic Study Abroad. Then did graduate research work in Morocco, where I find myself now. That was the first time I came here to Morocco was 2016, 2017. The topics I'm interested in, include, well, so sorry, let me back up. I wrote my dissertation on al-Maʿarrī, who I'll be speaking about today, but the focus of my dissertation was a bit different than what I work on now. So what I wrote my PhD thesis about was how al-Maʿarrī sort of negotiates an authorial identity for himself, an identity as a writer and an author, by using self-commentary. That's something that you find in a lot of his works, where he will write a thing itself, a collection of poetry or a bit of arts prose, of rhyming prose, or something else like that, and then he'll attach to it some kind of commentary. A lot of them are explanations of language, but there are some where he defends himself against supposed notional attacks or notional charges of disbelief, of heresy, of being a troublemaker and things like that. And so that was my sort of the basis of my dissertation. And now, still sticking with al-Maʿarrī, I've kind of gone in a different direction. And what led me to that was thinking about how I sort of wanted to, I do really much appreciate the work that I was able to do with commentary. But what I found is that it led me a bit further away from the poetic, aesthetic texts themselves and more into intellectual history. And I love intellectual history. It's not like I don't. But I found myself wanting to spend more and more time with the poetry itself and with the literature itself. And so my focus has shifted to something very topical that al-Maʿarrī writes about often, which is animals, and which has been little studied in modern scholarship. There are some high points in that scholarship, and I'll mention some of those. But anyway, that's kind of what I'm working on now. I'm writing a book about this topic, and we'll be happy to talk about it today. Generally speaking, I am interested in the strange and unusual. I'm interested in things that make me laugh. About Arabic literature. I'm interested in things that challenge my language and in which authors will sort of use language in a new way. And Maʻarrī fits all of these things and more. The way he writes, as many of you probably know, is very stylistically difficult and challenging. And that happens for its own sake. I think this is something all of us who study the Islamic hate traditions that we do appreciate, which is that there comes a point where literary authors in particular will sort of play with language itself to the point where the language itself becomes a performance. And so we can all think of, for example, the maqamat of al-Hariri, which themselves in Arabic are a performance, and then which have recently been translated by Michael Cooperson in The Impostures, in which he sort of recreated a linguistic performance in English. Anyway, that's just one aspect of these things that keeps me coming back to them. And I try to convey this sense of attachment I have to these texts and these authors for other people as much as I can, which is why I love doing things like this, and I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I guess I wanted to open the floor to questions or just comments or anything like that that sort of might have perked up in your mind as you heard me talking about the things that I like about this stuff, what keeps me coming back to it, and maybe that resonates with something an experience that you've had or something that you feel about it. Maybe we can talk about that for a few minutes.
Okay, so that's everyone's possibility to ask question, not just me. Please go ahead if you have any questions in mind. You can just you can actually raise your hand or just ask it.
And it doesn't have to be about work too. It can be about I enjoy all kinds of food and have the occasional hobby and things like that, whatever you want.
So what happens here, I think you gave a very, very good introduction, which was very short but very round. It is so it's not that obvious, but first thing first, what is your background? Your family, how did you said you studied at this university, so
oh yeah, I'll mention that in a moment, but first I want to acknowledge Samer's beautiful chat comment. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, well, I have to say Summer is not completely objective in this business. Look, if you look at the other participants, you will understand. Yes.
Well, I feel an instant kinship with anyone who who must protect themselves from the cold, in more creative ways, I guess, than having hair. So I did my undergraduate work at Brigham Young University. I expect that most of you haven't heard of this university, which is fine. Again, I would expect that. It's in the Western United States. So, between California, or after, like to the east of California is Nevada, and to the east of that is a state called Utah. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, but there is, nestled in the mountains of Utah is Brigham Young University. I didn't grow up there. I grew up in the East Coast near Washington, D.C. And so kind of made my first pilgrimage to the West to do undergraduate studies there. And again, it was formative for me because it's a school known for foreign language study. And in fact, I've become a part of that proud tradition now by I'm here in Morocco leading an Arabic study abroad program. So it's humbling and exciting for me to come full circle, coming as a product of the Arabic program at Brigham Young University, or BYU as we say for short, and then coming back around to give that experience to new generations of students is something very gratifying. And of course, to have had a little over a decade of experience beyond undergraduate work. I did a master's program at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Lived for a year in Cairo, as I mentioned, PhD at University of Chicago, including a year in Morocco, and I've been at BYU for a little over 6 years now.
Okay, so I can ask some other questions, but I would be very happy if others would also do. Yeah, well, so that's the past where I come from. Well, actually, do you want to talk about your family background?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is that I'm the first person in my immediate family, my mother and father and my sister and I, to finish university. They all did some university at some point, took some classes, but never finished, let alone, did a master's degree or did a PhD. So for me, it was a trial by error kind of process. And of course, I had help from, many friends and colleagues along the way who were more familiar with the process. But for me, it was a bit, experimental, trying to navigate this path. And again, I did not grow up speaking any language other than English. And so learning foreign languages was also, I always felt that it was, once I started living in another country like Brazil, I felt that it was a part of me, something that I was well equipped to do, but didn't know how to do it. So anyway, all of this means that, I'm excited to be doing what I'm doing because I appreciate it as someone who, came into it not having had it before, and for someone for whom it's unusual in my family, I guess. For that reason also, what I do has raised eyebrows, from time to time among, the people that I did, both being an academic, which again is, unusual for the average person, I think, at least in the circles that I run in, and then also doing Islamic studies, and people are mystified when I say that I read and research classical Arabic literature. They sort of have no idea what to do with me, which is fine. Then it opens a conversation, and I get to talk to them about some of the things that I do. So that's fun.
Well, I guess it is an advantage of our field that if you mention it, then well, people get interested, and you can tell them things what will interest them. Yeah, okay. Yusuf, thank you, Yusuf, for coming. Yeah, you can see the question, right?
Great question. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. In fact, I don't want to spoil too much because I'll be talking about, information from one of the chapters, but it's a, it's a topic that if you read things by al-Maʿarrī, animals are, that is, if you read anything by al-Maʿarrī, you very quickly run into animals. It's hard to avoid them. And especially because he was known as a staunch vegan and as a staunch advocate for animals. And that shows up in kind of interesting ways. There are writings where he talks about this topic, more or less clearly, kind of like a treatise. And the thing I'll be talking about today is the closest we have to a Maʿarrīan treatise on animal ethics. But then there are other things where he writes about it quite obliquely, where he will, use animals as moral exemplars or moral symbols, things like this, kind of like might be more familiar from an Islamic or a medieval bestiary kind of idea, whether in the Islamic world or in Europe. One of the insights that I come to in my book is that to me, the al-Maʿarrī's concern for animals is intimately connected with his piety and what's known in Islam as zuhud, a term I think many of you are familiar with, not all of you, often translated as asceticism, but could be more broadly or generally translated as renunciationism or even simply piety. It has kind of a bad reputation in some authors' minds as something that in which a person goes beyond, in a negative way, goes beyond the mark in terms of what there is expected of them in terms of religious duties and things like this, edging closer to rahbaniyya. So very, very famously, there's no rahbaniyya in Islam. That's the famous hadith Nabawi. So anyway, that's one thing that I find is that animal ethics, animals in general, are closely linked to al-Maʿarrī's overall disposition of zuhud, which in turn, gives us insights that, like, for example, a lot of people today associate veganism with sort of a secular stance, especially in the West. Whereas, what I find is that for al-Maʿarrī, veganism is very much linked to his spiritual convictions. We can debate what those convictions are, but he's clearly a person of some kind of conviction such that he would live a life like this.
Samir has a question, but on this conviction, are you going to talk about what you think his religious convictions?
I will. I'll touch on
Okay.
that a little bit more in detail. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Samir.
Yeah. I always get this question. It's great. Yeah. So for everyone, in case you're not watching the chat, are you of no relation to Yahya Khalid? It's Khalid Yahya. So Khalid Yahya Blankinship, the historian. That is ironically what I thought all along. Similarity of names, I presume. There is a relation. We spell our last name the same. It's an unusual name, and it's an unusual spelling of an unusual name. So normally people spell it Blanken, but Khalid and I both spell it Blankin. This has been, a topic of conversation ever since I started graduate school in Islamic studies. People have been asking me a lot, as you can imagine. And so at one point I just said, I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna see what connection there is. So I emailed Khalid directly, and he's a lovely person. I've had dinner with him several times, but went to visit him at his home. He lives just outside Philadelphia, and is retired, has emeritus status from Temple University. So he's not my dad. He's not my uncle. He is a distant cousin. I never knew him growing up, nor did my family know him. But because of our mutual connection through Islamic studies, we've been able to kind of make this, to have a relationship. I think he figured it out one time. As a historian, of course, he's interested in his own family history. So he told me that he's technically speaking my father's third cousin once removed. So, take that for what it's worth. A distant cousin. But now I consider him a colleague and a friend, but no relation growing up. A lot of people think, he sort of, I would have been so lucky to have him as a father sort of ushering me into, the field of Islamic studies, but that wasn't the case.
So when I'm still working on Ibn al-Muqaffa a lot, but even I think a decade ago I had a discussion with Aziz al-Azmeh, and I was thinking on what to do after Ibn al-Muqaffa. It's not that easy to find someone like him about the same intellectual level. And then he suggested to go for al-Maʿarrī, and obviously al-Maʿarrī is one of the greatest minds who ever lived. And I mean, he's also one of the most difficult ones to read. How did you get into this business of studying him and his work? Or
Of
rather going to?
al-Maʿarrī. Yeah, yeah. No, I won't mention that actually. So I'm glad
Okay.
you asked. Yeah, I first read, I first heard al-Maʿarrī's name in an Arabic class at university. It was a fourth year Arabic class, and it was a class taught at Duke University by Miriam Cook,
Huh.
who her specialty is, you know, modern and contemporary Arabic literature. So she's not a classical Arabic literature specialist, but, you know, God bless her, she included snippets of classical Arabic in this, you know, class so that we had a wide breadth of reading. So we read everything from, you know, al-Maʿarrī and al-Jahid, and even the first three lines of the Mu'allaqah of Imr al-Qais, all the way up to like Nawal Sa'dawi and Ghassan Kanafani. And so it was a very, very wide range of you know, things in Arabic literature. Anyway, the line that we read by al-Maʿarrī, I'll never forget it to this day. It's actually it's probably his best known line of poetry, and it's not from the Luzumiyat, which are his best known collection. It's his best known poems. It's from his first collection, which is Saqt Azan, the first tinder spark, referring to, this is, you know, the kind of the spark that ignited his career, the spark of youth, you know, etc. Which it might be an ironic title because he later rejects those the project of those poems, which was to get gain, to write poems for money. Anyway, the line is this. It's in a poem of Ritha, an elegy for a dead person. He says, خفف الوطأ ما أظن أديم الأرض إلا من هذه الأجساد. And that means lighten your step. To me, I think the surface of the earth is made of nothing but all of these bodies. And referring to all the generations of people who have died before then, and all the generations of people who will die since after that. That's right. Sayyid wrote the first line of that poem. غير مجد في ملتي واعتقادي. And he's talking about how weeping over dead people is not useful. This is sort of al-Maʿarrī's stoicism regarding death, you know, and that death is to be welcomed, not feared. This is the quintessential stance of a Zahid, you know, to pretend, to think as if to act as if you're already dead. Yeah, I know, it is interesting. He wrote this early in his career. He was already, I mean, from a, you know, the stance of even a young man, probably in his early 30s, he was already thinking about these things, which I always thought was too early to have a midlife crisis. And then I hit age 35 or 37, and I thought, nope, it is exactly the right time to have a midlife crisis. Your mid 30s or late 30s. So anyway, I read that line and I didn't understand it at first because I didn't have enough Arabic, and it took me a long time. And we had to talk about it in class before it finally clicked what he was saying. And I thought, oh my goodness, who is this person? Who would write such a thing? You know, and it made me curious about him and wanted to find out more. And that started this, you know, kind of an obsession with trying to find out what he meant by that. And, you know, early stirrings of interest in al-Jahid also. We read a part from the Kitab al-Bukhala, the Book of Misers by al-Jahid, talking about how people, you know, how a particular miser used a lamp and tried to squeeze every last bit of oil usage out of that lamp because he was a miser, and other things like this. You know, I've always been more into sort of the old stuff, the classical, the ancient, you know, these things. It can be surprisingly entertaining and insightful and enriching, and also challenging because, you know, obviously these people wrote and spoke and thought in a way very different from how we do today, and that can be half of the fun and the challenge, is to wrap your head around this, to understand that, you know, a lot is the same now as it was then, but a lot's also different. A lot has also changed.
Well, I hope it's more a quarter of life crisis in your case, at the age of 35. Yeah, actually, Miriam was here in Exeter with us for a year teaching. We were very lucky because she came with Bruce, so both of them
That's great.
were here. Yes, it was wonderful. So yes, and then yeah, well, so what's your plan? So okay, Kevin. So what do you think? who you are, and what you would like to be, so, and what you would like to do in the future. So we have something of a story ahead. Well, you were asking for questions.
Yeah. Well, your question couldn't come at a better time, but also at a worse time, because I unfortunately don't have a very good answer for you. And that's because I'm going through still the same sense of crisis. I it's it's quite a thing to spend time in this field, and to have a sense of proficiency in it, and then to start to watch the generation of masters that you studied with start to retire, to start to get ill, and to start to pass away. And that's something that's happened to me. And watching that, I realized that there are just a few people who can do the kind of things that we do, and it's a privilege, but it's also in a way sort of a burden. A burden that we gladly take on, but a burden in the sense that these traditions, these texts, these languages, and these civilizations kind of depend on people like us to keep going and to shoulder the work. And so that's kind of the feeling that I'm wrestling with right now, as I try to decide what my role is in this field, if that makes any sense. One thing that I find that I find very gratifying is being able to help younger people who are just starting on this path, and to try and get a leg up in terms of what they're doing. Whether that's helping them with their language, like these undergraduate students here in Morocco, or with younger scholars who are in graduate school, or something like that, to sharpen their thinking and their writing and other things like that. So that's one thing that I've found a lot of satisfaction in and hope to continue. As for my own work, what I'm in a phase now where I have a sense of my own ignorance about the breadth and entirety of the field. And so one thing I'm trying to do is just read as much as I can, especially from the primary texts themselves, to really become familiar with the nooks and crannies of classical Arabic literature as much as one person can. It's an impossible project. I could take several lifetimes to do this and not complete it. But that's one thing I'm trying to do right now.
Okay, so boredom is not facing you. That's that's good. And
Yeah.
well, I think that's a good transition to your topic, and then we can discuss these things and others further after the lecture.
Great. Sounds good. Well, I'll jump right into it. Thank you again for inviting me, Istvan, and to all of you for coming and for helping set this up. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see the presentation? Okay. If you can't, please shout.
Go
ahead. Okay. Yeah, if you can't, please shout into my ear, and I'll be happy to go back and try and fix it. All right. So I'll be talking today about this man that I've spent over a decade with, al-Maʿarrī, and an exchange of letters that he had with another man, a poet, a missionary, and a leading figure in his own right, al-Muʻayyad l-Dīn, al-Shīrāzī. And we'll be talking about veganism. I wanted to start by asking why in the world we should argue about veganism. And I have one or two nuggets up here to share. First, a quote from this great book. It's called The Heretic's Feast, A History of Vegetarianism by Colin Spencer. It's in a new edition, and I forget the title of it. The title is less entertaining, less striking than this original title, but it's still, the same book. Colin Spencer says, except for a few rare spirits, meat eating has been the cornerstone of society. For anyone to abstain from it was unusual. So he's talking about voluntary veganism. Obviously, there are a lot of people in the world throughout history who have been forced into veganism, or into avoiding consumption of animal products because of poverty. That's not what Colin Spencer is describing. He's talking about people who willingly, despite having the resources to consume animal products, avoid doing so. One thing that he talks about in his book also is he links this practice of veganism to an overall contrarian, iconoclastic disposition and character. He says that the figures that we know of who were vegan or supposedly were vegan tended to also be iconoclastic, people who went against the grain, just because meat eating is such an ingrained practice that it wouldn't surprise you for the kind of person to voluntarily avoid not just eating meat, but consuming all animal products to also be this way about other things. So one thinks, for example, about Pythagoras or Voltaire or Leonardo da Vinci, people who, St. Francis of Assisi, people who weren't necessarily, who went against the grain in some way or another. And so, yeah.
I assume iconoclastic here is in metaphorical sense.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm using that. Yeah, I'm using that metaphorically, not actual iconoclastic. Another reason I put up here that might be useful to argue about veganism, specifically about al-Maʿarrī, is to shed light on the more recent edition of these letters that we'll talk about, created by Ihsan Abbas. Now, the first edition of the letters was published in 1902 by David Margoliouth, and he based it on a single manuscript and translated the whole thing to his credit. Then in 1982, Ihsan Abbas created a new edition which includes these letters, but also other letters written by al-Maʿarrī, in which he relied on some 5 manuscripts, most of them incomplete, but one or two of them are complete editions of, or complete witnesses of the letters. So anyway, since Margoliouth's translation, I'm not aware of anyone who has given full attention to these letters, especially in light of Ihsan Abbas's recent edition, nor have they like checked the manuscripts also to see what's in there, what might have been left out, etc. Ihsan Abbas's edition is very good. There's no reason not to rely on that, but just to in addition to consult the manuscripts themselves to see what's useful. And so to put up a quote from al-Maʿarrī in this vein, there's also the issue of something else that I'd like to point out about the letters that, again, has not been fully addressed by scholars, not because they necessarily ignored it, but just because it just hasn't happened yet, and I don't fault them. Al-Maʿarrī says in his exchange with this other gentleman, this other person, God does nothing but good. This proposition must be either true or false. If it be true, still we see that evil prevails, and we know that this is a mystery. In other words, if God is the creator of good, then where does evil come from? So immediately he raises the problem of evil in terms of this debate about veganism. Hence, professedly religious persons have at all times been anxious to abstain from animal products, since they cannot be got without hurt to animals, which at all times shun pain. So throughout his letters, al-Maʿarrī, and especially in the first one, there's 5 letters that are exchanged, and al-Maʿarrī links the problem of veganism, his injunction to veganism, with the problem of evil. That people, in order to, because they don't know where evil comes from, and therefore because they don't know how much good or evil they do in the world, err on the side of caution and err on the side of not doing, of doing less harm than more harm. So if you think that if you don't know if you'll be doing more or less harm by doing a thing, better not to do it. That's kind of his reason for doing this, and the main thing. And I'll contrast that with other historical reasons that people have left us for adhering to vegetarian or vegan lifestyle. To give you a brief sense of where I'll be going in my remarks, there'll be 3 basic sections. The first is introducing these 2 individuals and the letters that they wrote. The second are I'm sorry. The second part should say something like attack and rebuttal, or accusation and rebuttal. Sorry, but it's sort of similar vein because they argue about a poem, which is why it says. And then medieval public relations, which I'll get to. So first, this sort of introduction. I want to talk first about what I mean by veganism. It's a bit of an anachronism to use this term. It is a modern term, but it's sort of the best approximation I can find to what al-Muʻayyad says about al-Maʿarrī, and al-Maʿarrī doesn't reject this characterization of what he does, of what he adheres to. So in one of the letters, the first letter that al-Muʻayyad fi d-Dīn writes to al-Maʿarrī, he says, "As'alahu an al-illati fi tahrimihi ala nafsihi al-luhuma wal-albana." I inquire as to the reason of his forbidding flesh and dairy products unto himself. This statement encapsulates animal products more generally. He's not just talking about animal flesh, he's talking about dairy. And therefore, it starts to verge into the realm not just of vegetarianism, but of veganism. And al-Maʿarrī doesn't reject this characterization. What he does instead, actually, I'm sorry, the impetus for al-Muʻayyad writing this is a poem that al-Maʿarrī wrote, in which al-Muʻayyad read, and is interested in knowing why al-Maʿarrī wrote it and what he means by it. The poem tells people, urges people in a way that could be called evangelizing, preaching, to avoid using animal products in general. I will not read the whole poem. I'll just give you a sense for what al-Maʿarrī says. This is the most important part in terms of what we're talking about: animal ethics, animals, veganism, this sort of thing. So it's one of his Luzumiyya poems, rhyming in ha and in the tawil meter. And these are the most important lines in which he talks about what I just mentioned, urging people not to use any animal products whatsoever. And it's very clear he's talking about, again, all animal products, not just flesh, not just eggs, other things like that. Yeah. So I'll read it first in the Arabic, just these few lines, and then the English translation. غدوت مريض العقل والدين فالقني لتسمع انباء الامور الصحائح ولا تاكلن ما اخرج الماء ظالما ولا تبغي قوتا من غريض الذبائح ولا بيض امات ارادت صريحه لاطفالها دون الغواني الصرائح ولا تفجعن الطير وهي غوافل بما وضعت في الظلم شر قبائح ودعت ضرب النحل الذي بكرت له كواسب من أزهار نبت فوائح فما أحرزته كي يكون لغيرها ولا جمعته للندى والمنائح. So all of that in English says, in my translation anyway, says, you are ailing in mind and faith, so come see me to hear of things as they truly are. Don't ever eat what the water gives up under duress, or seek fare in the newly slain, or mother's fresh milk which they wished for their babes, not as drink for highborn maids. Do not terrify carefree birds who know not what is done, for cruelty is the basest of evils. And shun thick white honey struck fresh early in the morning, collected from fragrant blooms. The hive didn't amass it just to give it away, or gather it just to be charitable. A bit of humor there, talking about these bees doing all this hard work only to have it stolen from them. So this is the poem. This is an excerpt from the poem, the most important excerpt, dealing with avoiding animal products, what we today call veganism, that al-Muʻayyad saw and was so struck by, and about which he asks al-Maʿarrī. I wanted to give a sort of historical overview of a few high points about arguments that people have made in the past for why to avoid animal products. Pythagoras, supposedly, we don't have any of his original writings. We have the writings of people who knew him, who studied with him, who claimed to speak in his name. Abstained from meat to purify his body and to get closer to the gods. In this, we might compare it to Ibn Arabi's White Death, and that there's a circumstantial connection to metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, reincarnation, whatever you want to call it. Pythagoras studied with Pherecydes, who's credited with the doctrine of metempsychosis, and with Thales, known for teaching pantheism, i.e. that everything is full of gods. Al-Ghazali's Kasr al-Shahwatain is also human-centered in the sense that it urges people to avoid eating meat because it's good for them, i.e. for humans. Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, whose title character is raised by a compassionate gazelle. And after reflecting further, Hayy turns to, I shouldn't say vegetarianism here. What he says is that, you should avoid excess, basically, to avoid doing, unnecessary disruption to God's creation. In 13th and 14th century millenarian movements, such as the Dautists, the Nuqtavis, and then later the Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great, who installed a cult that worshipped him as divine and professed metempsychosis and by extension vegetarianism. The idea that if you're eating an animal, if you're eating a product come from an animal, that animal could have once been a human, is the idea. Clement of Alexandria in the Christian tradition thought that demons were infatuated with the blood of red meat, and so anyone who overindulged animal flesh would attract evil spirit possession. And you can read more about this in Travis Proctor's great book, Demonic Bodies and the Dark Ecologies of Early Christian Culture. Very nice title. All of these are anthropocentric reasons for being vegan. All of these are human-focused reasons, primarily. That even the argument that souls transmigrate is a human-centered argument, because what you're doing is you're saying that if you're doing harm to an animal, you could be doing harm to a human, or what was once a human, a human soul that now inhabits the being of an animal, something like that. After this, let me briefly introduce al-Maʿarrī. I have a few quotes to give you a sense of who this person is that we're dealing with. One people described him as a man in perplexity. A man in perplexity. I've already read to you the line of poetry where he says, "Lighten your step. I think the surface of the earth is made of nothing but all these bodies." Al-Maʿarrī also wrote his own tombstone epitaph, which still stands today. The statue does not. It was beheaded in 2013 by extremists from the Nusra Front in Syria, 2 years after the Syrian civil war began. The epitaph says, "This is my father's crime against me, which I myself committed against none," referring to bringing children into this world. Al-Maʿarrī is what we would call an anti-natalist, someone who thought that bringing children into the world was a crime against those children because this world is sick and fallen. And then I've already read to you the first line of this poem, where he urges people to avoid any animal products of any kind, in which he says, "You are ill in your mind and faith, come listen to me." This man did not have a low opinion of himself. He was very sure about his opinions, and he was not afraid to share them, at least in certain contexts and in certain ways. He did dissimulate. In fact, he has another statement in which he says, "I dissimulate with you, but then again, all religion is dissimulation." Very controversial, very provocative. Just a brief overview of his life and works. He was born at Ma'arat Norman, as suggested by his toponym, his nisba. And he was blinded at age 4 from smallpox. So he was blind his entire life, or something like, practically speaking, he was blind. He says in a later work that by age 4, he couldn't tell a full-grown camel from a baby camel calf. He took a trip to Baghdad at approximately the first decade of the 11th century, and probably when he was around 30. And stayed only for 18 months. There are various reasons given for why he did that. But after 18 months, he decided to live a life of seclusion. He returned to his hometown of Ma'arat Norman, lived an austere lifestyle, supposedly ate only lentils and dates, slept on his prayer mat, wore coarse wool, things like this. But he wasn't secluded in sort of in a strict sense, because many people came to study with him. He had many exchanges of letters with intellectuals and leaders, public leaders, and died at age 85 and had many mourners at his funeral. And some of the poetry survives of people who wrote elegies for him at his funeral. In terms of the works that he wrote, the most famous in the Arabic speaking world is Luzum ma la yalzam, which means self-imposed necessity, referring to using double end rhyme. So instead of having one rhyming consonant at the end of a line, which is normal for Arabic poetry, he would impose upon himself 2, which makes it much harder to rhyme and makes the sound much richer. And for that reason, it's often called rich rhyme in other traditions. And he wrote an entire collection of poetry doing this. This is poetry in which he talks about zuhud, wa'adh, which you might call pious counsel, rationalist critique of religion, and so on. The best known work by him in the West is the Epistle of Forgiveness, Risālat al-Ghufrān, a tour of eschatological tourism, in the words of Gregor Scholler, a journey through heaven and hell, in which the protagonist meets many poets, discusses heresy and heretics, and more. Another strange work having to do with animals is called the Epistle of the Horse and the Mule, Risālat al-Sāhil wa Shāhij. Again, this is a meandering work. It's populated by talking animal characters, and it discusses society, politics, grammar, poetry, all kinds of things. And then this exchange of letters with al-Muʻayyad Fidin, which is my topic today. And speaking of Mu'ayyad Fidin, a brief introduction to him. He was born at Shīrāzī into a family of Fatimid missionaries. He gathered a following around him in Fars migrated to Cairo in the wake of pushback from the Buyids and Abbasids to his influence. And he worked his way up the hierarchy to become the chief missionary, the Da'i ad-Du'a, and the head of the Dawah administration before he was exiled to Jerusalem in 1061 AD by a rival, the Vizier Ibn al-Mudabbir. He returned to Cairo the next year and trained the Yemeni Qadi Lamak ibn Malik al-Hammadi and died not too, around the same age as al-Maʿarrī, but 20 years later. And his works include a long compendium of 800 lectures called the al-Majalis al-Mu'ayyadiyya on symbolic interpretation of the Quran, Hadith, and Sharia, 2 treatises on metaphysics, Sharh al-Ma'ad and al-Ibtida' wal-Intiha'. He has a diwan of poetry with 62 poems, an autobiography, and then this exchange of letters, which I mentioned before. So I'll give a brief overview of these letters because I don't want to take up too much time. There are 5 letters in total, 3 by al-Mu'ayyad Fiddin and 2 by al-Maʿarrī. So al-Mu'ayyad Fiddin initiates the exchange and al-Maʿarrī responds, and they go back and forth for 2 exchanges. The question that leads al-Mu'ayyad to this exchange is, what's the root reason for al-Maʿarrī's dietary practice? He also accuses al-Maʿarrī of zuhud and taqa'ur, meaning excessive difficulty in his language, belief in something like karma, and trying to outdo the creator in mercy, because of course Islam permits the use of animal products. And so al-Mu'ayyad asks al-Maʿarrī, are you trying to be more merciful than the merciful, capital M? And in al-Mu'ayyad's first letter, in response, he says what I mentioned. He brings up the problem of evil, which is that people of faith avoid trying to do evil, and if they don't know how much evil a certain act will do, then they avoid it out of caution. Further, what's good and evil is unclear, as is the source of evil. He rejects Zoroastrian dualism, for example. One of, I can't remember who it was, but someone asked, it might have been Ishtvan. You asked if I would touch on sort of the nature of his beliefs, and this is one thing he rejects. He also invokes the idea of whatever God wills. I'll talk about that a bit later. And in practical terms, he says, I'm old and I can't shake the habit of not eating meat. I'm also poor and I can't afford meat. So he has gives these ideological, high-minded reasons for avoiding meat, but then he says, in the end, I've been doing it for 50 years. Why would I stop now? I'll skip the rest of this just because that's kind of what we need to have the rest of the conversation. So, and Mu'ayyad rejects these arguments, and he says that al-Maʿarrī's practice implies the belief that pain inflicted on animals will be avenged by God, and that whoever thinks this way has reached the outermost bound in zuhud and wound up at the farthest extent therein, and for him zuhud is a bad thing. He also accuses al-Maʿarrī of avoiding animal products either because compassion has taken al-Maʿarrī, overwhelmed him, like snatched him up, but in this al-Maʿarrī is trying to be more merciful than God, or 2, that al-Maʿarrī thinks it's an unwise practice to consume animal products, in which case it still falls back on God, who knows the bounds of wisdom. In other words, al-Maʿarrī is saying this is unwise versus this other thing, and al-Mu'ayyad says only God knows what's wise. And then in the end, he also accuses al-Maʿarrī of spending too much time studying grammar and poetry and not enough thinking about his faith. And I wanted to connect this to an article that I read recently by Salvador Peña about Ibn Hazm. And Peña in that article discusses how grammarians and linguists were often portrayed as saintly and pious, with grammar and knowledge of language being explicitly linked to their sainthood and mysticism, therefore inspiring the suspicion of people like Ibn Hazm, and perhaps also of al-Mu'ayyad when he accuses of al-Maʿarrī. This is my addition to this. This isn't Salvador Peña saying this. I link this in my head to this accusation that al-Mu'ayyad raises against al-Maʿarrī, that he spends too much time thinking about grammar. Perhaps al-Mu'ayyad thought that, thought this same thing, associated this obsession with language and with grammar with this broader association with grammarians and linguists of people who are saintly and pious, who kind of make language or grammar into their religion, essentially. I mentioned that al-Mu'ayyad accuses al-Maʿarrī of zuhud, of being excessive in his zuhud. The core of zuhud, more broadly, is that you're educating your will, you're educating your desire. And so one Quranic verse typically associated with this is Surah Al-Kahf 8, verse 5. Lo, we have placed all that is on the earth as an ornament thereof, that we may try them, which of them is best in conduct. There are various genres associated with Zuhud, all of them, squarely within the mainstream of Islam. And all of this, means that Zuhud to, many people would just go by the name of piety, which any practicing Muslim would be okay with. So it's interesting. What al-Muʻayyad probably means by Zuhud is something more like monasticism, over indulging the renunciationist impulse. Did al-Maʿarrī believe in reincarnation? Recall that al-Muʻayyad Fid-Dīn charged him with the implied belief that pain inflicted on animals will be avenged. Al-Maʿarrī, the short answer is no. Al-Maʿarrī did not believe in reincarnation. In fact, he explicitly makes fun of groups that he thought believed in reincarnation. So in the Epistle of Forgiveness, the Risalat al-Ghufran, he says this sect, referring to al-Hallaj and his disciples, propagates the idea of metempsychosis, tanasukh, which is an ancient belief held by the Indians, Ahl al-Hind. It's also become common among a group of Shiites. We reject these claims and ask God for success and protection. So this is explicit rejection of the doctrine of metempsychosis. He has a poem to this effect, which I'll skip over in the interest of time. And again, I'm reiterating what al-Maʿarrī does say about why he urges people to avoid animal products. Those who profess religion always seek to avoid animal products because those products are only obtained by harm to animals, which at all times flee from pain. He also often portrays animals as more moral than humans. Two of his lines of poetry say this: donate sips of water to birds gone by morning and count them worthier of alms than men. Their kind commits you no harm at all, even as you fear it from your own. Meaning, you're less afraid of innocent, cute little birds than you are of your own kind, of other humans. And this is something that, in my mind, recalls Plutarch's reimagined conversation between Odysseus and Gryllus, who was one of the crewmen, this is from the Odyssey, one of the crewmen from his ship, whom Circe changed into a pig, into a swine, and who, still in his form as a pig, lists dozens of ways in which animals prove more virtuous than people. For without command or instruction, he says, the souls of beasts naturally bring forth and develop such virtue as is proper in each case. So this is not just the Islamic tradition that has this idea. More virtuous than human. I've already mentioned the problem of evil. Al-Maʿarrī, in answer to this problem, where does evil come from, says, we submit and recite the verse, whomsoever God guides, he is rightly guided, and whomsoever he leads astray, thou wilt not find for him a protector to direct. And another Quran verse to this effect, which looks a lot like voluntarism, the idea that God is the one who decides what's right and wrong, which is surprising because, for intellectuals, it can seem kind of like a loophole, kind of like you're avoiding the question. Where does evil come from? God decides. Are things evil in and of themselves? God decides. Who's to say? God decides. And it's interesting because al-Maʿarrī also said about, the idea of people invoking religious arguments like this, that there are two kinds of people on the earth: those with brains but no religion, and those with religion but no brains. So very interesting to hear, the same person who made that argument invoking an argument like voluntarism. He could be doing this just to get out of the argument. He could be doing this just to say, who's to say, and sort of hiding what he actually thinks. That's always a possibility. Finally, why did al-Muʻayyad write these letters to al-Maʿarrī? The Fatimids, in particular, of which al-Muʻayyad was the chief missionary. He would later become the chief missionary. He wasn't at this time when he exchanged these letters with al-Maʿarrī. But this denomination in particular represented an ideological threat to many with competing claims on Islamic orthodoxy. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, the Fatimid Caliph imams undertook, in the words of Tahir Qutbuddin, a well-organized and highly secret institution for religious education and proselytization known officially as the da'wah, the preaching or the call. And this involved dispatching missionaries like al-Muʻayyad Fid-Dīn to other lands to preach in person, and as well as disseminating written texts and corresponding with key rulers, intellectuals, and patrons. So there are examples of this, and al-Maʿarrī's exchange with al-Muʻayyad fi d-Dīn represents such an example. I want to draw attention to the fact that the source for come back to this. The source for what I'm about to show you is from the work I mentioned of 800 sessions, majalis, by al-Muʻayyad fi d-Dīn, in which he discusses various aspects of Ismaili doctrine and practice and other things like this. In one of these volumes, he has a discussion with his followers about al-Maʿarrī and what they should do about him, because in their view, by being such a prominent figure who was advocating for something like veganism, he would draw people away from proper faith. And I just want to point out at this juncture that this work, al-Majalis al-Mu'ayyadiyya, is now the subject of a new project at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, led by Omar Ali Deonzaga, to translate the whole work and also to collate all the manuscripts that we have of this work and to cross-reference them. He's already completed an index of Quranic citations in the Majalis, which is part of a broader index of Quranic citations in Ismaili literature, or IQCIL, I-Q-C-I-L. I'm happy to put this slide up again if you want more time to take up notes. Anyway, there's a section in volume 5, I think volume 5, maybe volume 6 of these Majalis, in which al-Mu'ayyad talks to his followers about al-Maʿarrī, in which he has to calm them down, because in my English translation, and I'll skip reading the Arabic just in the sake of time, the story has reached you about the blind man, meaning al-Maʿarrī, who gained notoriety at Ma'arat al-Nu'man and what was attributed to him of unbelief and excess-driven impiety, tughyan, due to his extreme abstention from many foods which God has permitted in moderation, talking about his abstention from animal products. Word of him reached every corner and moved people to destroy him out of compassion, out of passion, from their allegiance to faith and out of their sense of honor, ghayra, for Islam and all Muslims. One day, talk of him was going around the session of the overseer. That might be al-Mu'ayyad fi d-Dīn. That might be another person whose job it was to oversee these majalis. And everyone gathered was emboldened after al-Maʿarrī's blood, saying that honor for religion, ghayra al-Dīn, permitted them to kill him. But then one of the attendees said, "Your words make no sense. If it's true that the man is old and weak and staring down at the grave from its closest portico, when death's hand is finally reached out to him, he will have glory from people's admirable mention of him, a glory that we ourselves could never hope for." In other words, if they do what these followers suggested and kill al-Maʿarrī, he will become a martyr for the cause of veganism. No, instead we must dispatch unto him someone who will pierce his facade through debate and disputation, who will expose his faults to people so that he falls short in their eyes and his status among them is debased. And for this reason, supposedly, they dispatched al-Mu'ayyad fi d-Dīn through letters, through this exchange of letters, in order to expose al-Maʿarrī's intellectual and spiritual faults in the public square. A few takeaways, and then I'll be done. Al-Maʿarrī was not a systematic thinker like Avicenna, but rather a gadfly and a lover of the written and spoken word. Again, as I mentioned, on the one hand, he claims that people should be rational in how they believe religion and how they follow it. At the same time, he appeals to an argument like voluntarism, which to some intellectuals might seem like avoiding the question of where evil comes from. That's just a quick example of one of what might seem like a contradiction. Al-Maʿarrī was not a heretic in the sense that he held heterodox belief. In fact, he mocks those like Shiites and Sufis whom he thinks do have such beliefs. I mentioned the case of metempsychosis, of transmigration of souls, as an example of this. There were heterodox beliefs available to someone like al-Maʿarrī at the time that he did not adhere to and in fact roundly rejected. So it's less useful to call him a heretic, less appropriate to call him a heretic or heterodox in that sense. And Mu'ayyad fi d-Dīn, for his part, probably did not think he could convince al-Maʿarrī to change his ways. Rather, he was trying to change the views of observers, of people who were watching his debate with al-Maʿarrī. And then finally, the fact that these two men were arguing about a poem gives al-Maʿarrī the wiggle room, the space to dodge charges of heterodoxy. In fact, he says, "I state the matter as if about others, even if what I intend is my own nourishment, food, victuals, or provisions." One example of how al-Maʿarrī tries to get around accusations that could have been hazardous to his health and that could have damaged his reputation. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Well, that was wonderful. A proper firework. Thank you very much, Kevin. I really loved it, and I think we will stay here for a while. Just before we get to the question, and even before I advertise the next talk, I wanted to say there are indeed plenty of links between Ibn al-Muqaffa and al-Maʿarrī, and between the Kalila wa Dimna. And so even the introduction of the Kalila wa Dimna is very interesting for the issue of Zuhd and as a skeptic solution for morality. And then there is Kalila, who is killed in the Kalila wa Dimna, but he appears again in the Ikhwan as-Safaz trial against humanity, and he argues similarly that he is the emissary of the king of the animals, and he argues that men are worse as predators than the proper carnivores. So there is a story. And then in the Kalila wa Dimna there is a chapter which is a vegan chapter, that of the lioness who gives up eating meat. And it's interesting because, yeah, you said others are men-centered. This is not man, but not even lion-centered. It is for the sake of not harming others, and yeah. So there is a clear link. Also, I'm just wondering about whether we can really say he was not a systematic thinker if we consider that we just have a text claiming that they were considering killing him, and he explicitly says that he dissimulates. It's very possible there is a coherence, though, but it is hidden by Aesopian language. I happened to publish a paper on this because somehow in the West we don't realize that even today most people in the world cannot say what they mean. Even today, to be honest, even in Western academia, you cannot always say what you really mean. But elsewhere, really not. And this is the general historic experience. So I think it's a distorted idea that we should expect people in the past saying always what they really meant. It's just impossible. Okay, so you mentioned Tahira Qutbuddin in the talk, and I just want to say she was our guest on Wednesday, and her majlis is already online, the recording, and our next majlis will be by Robert Hoyland, and I put it into the chat, and it will be on Christian and Muslim papyri from Khirbet Mird, Palestine, an archive from the 7th and 8th centuries. So I put this into the chat, and I invite everyone to come again next Monday. But we will continue the joy of this evening right now, after I say goodbye to everyone who will see this as a recording, because now I'm going to close the recording and we get into the question.